So before we go into the actual steps involved in an audit, or before we begin to identify the kinds of knowledge assets you want to audit, let's step back and think about what the purpose of an audit is. So Bright describes an audit as the collation of an inventory of knowledge resources or assets in a given working environment. Notice the emphasis here on a specific working environment. When you're auditing your knowledge assets, it's the assets that are held by a specific organization. A knowledge audit can be carried out at various levels within an organization using different methods that are suitable to the kind of knowledge asset we're auditing. And we'll go into this a little bit more as we progress through the course. Auditing methods can include things like surveys, interviews, observations, task analyses, documentation, inventorying, and so on. According to Botha, the purpose of auditing is diagnostic. In other words, to discover, check, verify, and control some or other process or resource in an organization. So we want to understand what our knowledge assets are, what our intellectual capital is. We want to be able to discover it, check it, verify it, and control it. What I would add to this statement is for the purpose of ensuring that the process or resource is being managed as the organization expects or as that particular industry advises or prescribes. So an audit is a systematic examination of the resources, their consumption, their production, and the management of resources within an organization. Audits of other kinds of capital have established procedures that guide the conduct of an audit. There are no established procedures at this point for auditing intellectual capital. One of the things to keep in mind about an audit, and we'll go into this a little bit more in section 2, is that an audit usually assumes that an external party is coming in to verify or validate that you're doing what you're saying you're doing. Now, there's a presumption here that is overlooked in most of the reports of knowledge audits that you will find discussed in the literature. The presumption is that you already have a balance sheet that you're maintaining on a regular basis of your intellectual capital assets. For example, when someone comes in to audit financial resources, the first thing that they ask for is your balance sheets, right, and your accounts. And you discuss with the organization's management which of those areas you're going to actually audit. In other words, you're going to walk through those balance sheets, those accounts, the accounting procedures to verify that the organization is behaving according to good practices. The challenge that we have with intellectual capital is that that balance sheet, those general good practice accounting procedures don't yet exist. So keep in mind that you're going to actually be doing, you're very likely going to be doing two things when you're conducting a knowledge audit for an organization. First, you're going to go about establishing that balance sheet. So what assets are important to the organization, and how do we think we should manage them? So that's the baseline against which your audit is actually going to be conducted. So the fact that you're creating there are two parts, as Botha and Bright hint, you're creating the inventory that can then be audited. Okay, but the inventory in itself is not necessarily the audit. The framework that you create is the context in which you would routinely account for, value, and manage your assets. But the actual audit is someone coming in from the outside to verify that you're doing what you're saying you're doing. I hope this is making sense. This is a gap that I have found in the literature, and it is what is primarily behind the confusion between knowledge management maturity modeling and knowledge auditing. Because there are good practice standards for other kinds of capital, it is easier for those external experts to be identified and for them to come in and do a formal audit. So we don't yet have the same level of comfort with intellectual capital. So how do we know when we're using intellectual capital optimally? How do we know we're investing it for the correct amount? We're investing in it for the correct amount. I think when we begin to understand the auditing process, we see what some of our challenges are. So the audit helps us to determine whether or not our capital resources are being used to achieve the organization's goals and objectives. An audit also involves assigning a monetary cost and a value to these resources. In other words, what is the value of the resource to the organization? When they're not being effectively used, we need to be able to estimate a value to help the organization determine the cost of the suboptimal actions. So do you have people with high levels of expertise that are not necessarily in positions where that expertise is being used or consulted or valued? So this is a significant challenge because for reasons that you may not be familiar with if you haven't yet studied the economic of information and the economic of knowledge. There are some economic properties of intellectual capital that are different than those of other kinds of capital. Knowledge assets are not scarce, and one of the main anchor points of most of our economic theory and assumptions is that resources are scarce. Knowledge is not scarce. Access to knowledge may be scarce. The time that you have to consume knowledge may be constrained. Information and knowledge assets have significant positive externalities. In other words, when they are used, they are not necessarily diminished. They are, in fact, enriched, and the value goes up the more it is consumed. And knowledge assets also may not be well represented by market prices. It may be that that the markets are simply between a small group of people. Okay? And pricing strategies may be different just because the nature of consumption of knowledge is different. In other words, it doesn't become more scarce the more it's consumed. Okay, so take your own organization as an example. And step back to think about whether your organization routinely conducts audits of other kinds of assets. In other words, is the auditors coming in to check your finances? Does your accounting department routinely conduct audits of your physical resources? Now think about that effort being transferred to intellectual capital assets, and explain why you might want to conduct an audit of your knowledge assets. I think at this point, the story that I often tell about Microsoft or Google, let's take Google as an example. Google headquarters is located in an earthquake-prone zone. In fact, they're not too far from the San Andreas Fault. If Google's headquarters were to be destroyed in an earthquake, what do you think would be the greatest impact? Would it be the impact to the physical capital, the impact to the financial capital, or the impact to the intellectual capital? In other words, if Google lost its buildings and its hardware, its servers, would they be able to replace those, and how would they estimate the loss? If Google lost all of its engineers in that earthquake, what would be the cost of replacing all those engineers? And what's the current value of those engineers? And would they be able to recover?